Tonight, we will take a calm look at the events people later called the Trojan War. Some parts of this story became myths, but there are also real facts from history and archaeology. In this narration, we will stay with what is known and supported by research. Before we go further, if you enjoy calm history told in a simple way, you may subscribe to hear more stories like this at your own pace. Now we begin. Troy was a city in the northwest area of what is now Turkey. It stood in a place where many ships passed through. Because of this, the people of Troy could trade with many groups. The city grew stronger and richer over time. Across the sea, in the land we now call Greece, there were several small kingdoms. These kingdoms were ruled by leaders we call Mycenaean kings. They built large stone centers, traded across the Mediterranean, and sometimes fought with neighbors. Records from the Hittite Empire, which ruled a large part of central Anatolia, mention a city that most experts link to Troy. These writings show that rulers in this region argued over trade, land, and control. Because of these signs, many historians think that one or more real conflicts happened around Troy during the Late Bronze Age. Later, poets turned these events into the long-tail people now known as the Trojan War. But behind the later stories were real cities, real people, and real struggles for power. This is where our quiet walk through history begins. As we continue, let us move deeper into the real background of the city of Troy and the world around it. We will keep our pace slow and steady, so it is easy to rest while listening. Troy was built near the entrance to a narrow water passage between the Aegean Sea and the inland areas that reach toward the Black Sea. Many ships passed through these waters. This made the land around Troy important. A city in this place could watch the sea routes, control trade, and collect goods from many travelers. Archaeologists have found several layers of Troy, which means the city was built again and again after fires, attacks, or natural damage. Each layer shows how life changed over hundreds of years. The people who lived in the region of Troy were in contact with groups from the islands, from Greece, from the wider coast of Anatolia, and from the large inland powers. They traded metal, grain, cloth, pottery, and other goods. Even though we cannot know their daily lives in detail, we can understand that they lived in houses with simple tools, raised animals, farmed their fields, and worked with bronze, wood, and clay. Their world was active and busy. Trade meant contact with many cultures. Across the sea, the Mycenaean kingdoms in Greece were also active in trade. They built strong walls around their centers. Some of these centers, like Mycenaean tyrants, still have remains that show the size and effort needed to build them. The Mycenaean world reached across southern Greece, parts of central Greece, and the nearby islands. They used writing called Linear B to keep records, mainly about goods and storage. These records show that their lives were also busy with farming, animal care, cloth making, metal work, and the management of supplies. Between the Mycenaean kingdoms and the region of Troy, there were many points of contact. Ships could travel across the sea in good weather. Traders could move goods between ports. There could also be moments of tension because trade and contact often lead to competition. These areas were full of movement, and change was common. Farther inland sat the Hittite Empire, which was a large power in Anatolia. The kings of the Hittites kept careful records on clay tablets. These tablets were written in cuneiform. Many have survived to this day. They give us important clues about what happened in the region. Some tablets mention a city called Wilusa. Many experts believe Wilusa was an older form of the name that later became Ilion, which people later used for Troy. These tablets also mention a group of people called the Ahiawa. Most experts think the Ahiawa were related to the Mycenaean world, possibly Mycenaean rulers or a larger group connected to them. The tablets show that the Hittite kings sometimes dealt with Mycenaean leaders. They wrote about conflict, peace agreements, and demands. These records show that this region did not rest in calm for long. Rulers argued over land, over who controlled which city, and over who had the right to influence the coast. One Hittite letter tells of a past conflict in the region of Wilusa. It speaks of a dispute that needed a settlement between a Hittite king and a ruler who may have come from the Mycenaean world. This is not proof of the later legendary war, but it does show that tension between these worlds was real. So when people in later times told stories about a great war at Troy, they may have been remembering bits of real conflicts that happened in this region. Over time, storytellers added heroes, dramatic battles, and long journeys. But beneath those later tales was a history shaped by trade routes, strong cities, and struggles for control. Let us now picture the land where all this took place. The coast of western Anatolia has rolling hills, small valleys, and stretches of open land. Streams flow toward the sea. In the late Bronze Age, people lived in small villages and farmed the land. They grew grain, kept sheep, goats, and cows, and fished near the coast. Their homes were made from mud brick, wood, and stone. Tools were simple and practical. Travel was slower than in our time. People moved on foot, by simple carts pulled by animals, or by ships that needed fair weather. A journey that we could make in a short time today could take many days back then. Still, people made those journeys often, because trade brought wealth and contact, brought knowledge. In Greece, the Mycenaean centers looked different. Many were built on hills. Their walls were strong, and at the top sat the palace where the ruler lived. The palace had rooms for storage, gatherings, and religious activity. There were also work areas for pottery, metal work, and cloth making. Below the palace were houses for the rest of the people. Outside the main centers, there were small farms, workshops, and fields. The Mycenaean world was active in the wider region. They traded with Cyprus for copper. They traded with Egypt for goods, and perhaps even valuable items like ivory. They also traded with lands in the Near East. Their pottery has been found across the Mediterranean basin, which shows how far their goods traveled. All these groups lived in a time when bronze was the main metal used for strong tools and weapons. Bronze is made by mixing copper and tin. Both metals needed to be mined, traded, and shipped. This brought many groups together, but it also caused competition. Control of trade routes meant power, and power meant security for a kingdom and its people. Because of this, the late Bronze Age saw many alliances, rivalries, and conflicts. No place stayed separate from its neighbors. Messages passed between rulers. Sometimes there was peace. Sometimes there were demands or threats. Sometimes there were battles. In the case of Troy, tension may have come from the desire to control the sea route. A wealthy and well-placed city like Troy was important to many groups. Trade through its region could bring profit. If a Mycenaean kingdom or a nearby power wanted more influence there, conflict could arise. These pressures shaped the world that later storytellers remembered as the age of the Trojan War. Archaeologists have found that one stage of the city of Troy ended in fire and destruction. This could have come from an attack, an accident, or another cause. We cannot know for sure, but the damage suggests that the city faced violent moments. Another layer also shows signs of damage and rebuilding. These layers remind us that the people of Troy lived through events that changed their city many times. When later generations listened to stories about the Trojan War, they heard about leaders from the Mycenaean world uniting to attack Troy. But in real history, it is more likely that smaller conflicts or repeated tensions took place. Groups may have fought over who controlled trade. They may have argued over which ruler held rights to nearby lands. These disputes could have built strong memories in the region. As stories passed from one generation to the next, details were added. Real events can grow into rich tales when told over many years. In time, storytellers shaped the history into a long story of a single war. They gave names to the leaders, added personal motives, and created a large, united force. But the seed of the story was likely a real struggle for power near the coast of Anatolia. Let us also remember that communication among these groups was not easy. Rulers relied on messengers who traveled long distances. These messengers faced risks on the road or at sea. Storms could stop ships. Bandits could strike on land. A message could take weeks to reach its destination. Because of this, misunderstandings were common. A delay in contact could lead to suspicion. Suspicion could lead to conflict. This slow and uncertain communication shaped the way kingdoms interacted. The Hittites knew of the Mycenaean world, but their knowledge was limited. The Mycenaean leaders knew of the lands across the sea, but they also did not know every detail. Rumors traveled easily, and leaders acted on incomplete information. This made the region unsteady. During the Late Bronze Age, there were also natural events that stressed many kingdoms. Drought, earthquakes, and changes in weather could harm crops. When food was low, people moved or fought for better land. Cities sometimes faced attacks from groups who traveled across the sea or along the coast. Pressure from such groups added to the tension in the region. Around the end of the Bronze Age, many large centers across the eastern Mediterranean faced serious trouble. Several cities were damaged or abandoned. Some groups moved across the sea seeking new places to live. This period is known as a time of collapse for many kingdoms. It left a deep mark on history. Troy also faced changes during this time. Some layers show signs of damage that may be linked to the wider troubles in the region. As trade routes shifted and kingdoms declined, Troy had to adapt. Cities that once had steady contact with others now faced new challenges. After several more layers of rebuilding, Troy eventually became less prominent in the region. When we look back at this long period, we can see why later people told large stories about it. They remembered a time when strong cities clashed, when trade brought wealth, and when powerful kingdoms struggled for control. They remembered a well-known city near the sea that stood at the center of important events. The memory of this city and its struggles became the core of the later tale of the Trojan War. Even though much of the later tale is myth, the real history behind it helps us understand how people lived, traded, and fought during the Late Bronze Age. It shows us how cities rose and fell, how rulers made choices, and how people tried to protect their homes. It also shows us that great stories often begin with real events, even if the details change with time. As we rest with this knowledge, we can picture the land once again. The hills near Troy, the sea routes that passed by its shores, the distant centers of the Mycenaean world, and the large inland realm of the Hittites. All these places were part of a wide network. People worked in their fields, sailed in their ships, and lived their daily lives. They had ordinary concerns like food, shelter, and safety. Their world was full of change, but also full of steady routines. This quiet picture can help us understand that the story of the Trojan War, even in its mythic form, grew from a real world of ordinary people. They lived through hardship, trade, cooperation, and conflict. Their memory shaped the later tale, and that tale shaped the way we remember the ancient world. As life continued in the region, the groups living near Troy kept dealing with the same concerns that shaped their past. They watched the sea, cared for their farms, repaired their homes, and traded when they could. Even during tense periods, daily tasks had to be done. People needed clean water, warm shelter, and steady food. They raised their children, cared for elders, and tried to keep peace within their homes and villages. Archaeologists who study Troy have found pottery, tools, and signs of workshops that show the steady flow of work. Even during times when the city walls were rebuilt or when parts of the city were damaged, life returned. People kept planting grain, storing food, and shaping pots from clay. They used simple ovens to bake bread and to cook whatever they could gather or trade. The land around Troy had both fertile soil and areas that were not easy to work. People adjusted by planting crops in the best spots and letting animals graze on the rougher ground. Sheep and goats were useful because they could live on land that did not support crops very well. These animals gave wool, milk, and meat, which were valuable for families. The nearby sea also helped them. Fish and shellfish could be caught near the shore. Small boats made from wood allowed travel along the coast. Some people may have carried goods between small ports. Others may have fished close to home, staying near the beach and rocky edges where fish gathered. Inside the city, the leaders of Troy had to keep order. They watched the trade routes and kept track of goods that passed through. They also had to be careful in dealing with the larger powers nearby. A mistake in judgment could create tension with a stronger neighbor. Leaders had to understand what the Hittite kings expected. They also needed to know what the Mycenaean rulers wanted across the sea. This balance was difficult, but important for the survival of the city. The Mycenaean world had its own concerns. Palace officials wrote lists of goods, counted supplies, and organized labor. The kings needed to keep peace within their own lands. They also watched the coast, waited for ships, and kept an eye on rival centers. If one kingdom grew stronger, others took notice. These rulers understood that any shift in power could change the balance between them. Because so many groups were active at the same time, events in one place could affect many others. A change in trade patterns could bring hardship to one center while helping another. A conflict near the coast could close a sea route and force traders to find new paths. A poor harvest in one region might lead to more demand in another. These changes shaped the life of Troy, the Mycenaean world, and the larger inland powers. In time, the region saw stronger signs of stress. Scholars believe that movement of groups across the eastern Mediterranean increased. Some of these groups may have carried weapons and attacked coastal towns. Others may have been families leaving their homes in search of better land. Such movement made the region even more unstable. Strong cities that once held their ground began to weaken. The Hittite Empire, once a powerful presence in Anatolia, saw a steady decline. Records show signs of trouble inside the land they controlled. Food shortages, threats from enemy groups, and long conflicts weakened their rule. As the empire broke apart, cities that depended on it lost support. Some centers fell to attackers, others were abandoned. At the same time, some Mycenaean centers also faced trouble. Archaeology shows damage in several of their palace sites. The reasons are not always clear. Fire could have come from attack, unrest among the people, or an accident. But the outcome was the same. Once these centers burned, they were not rebuilt with the same strength. The system of palace rule in Greece slowly faded. In this period of broad decline, Troy also faced stress. The layers of the city show signs of damage and rebuilding during these years. Even if the city survived longer than some others, the world around it was no longer the same. Trade routes were disrupted. Strong allies became weak. The safe movement of goods and people was no longer certain. This made life harder for the people who lived there. Still, life did not end in a single moment. After each period of trouble, there were always people who tried to rebuild. They repaired homes, cleaned the streets, and planted new fields. Families tried to return to normal routines. They kept their simple customs, cooked familiar meals, and cared for their children. The city remained a place where people worked hard to maintain a steady life even when the world around them changed. As time passed, the memory of earlier events began to take shape in the minds of later generations. People remembered that Troy had stood near the sea, watched by strong walls. They remembered that powerful groups came from across the water. They remembered a time of conflict, loss, and rebuilding. Such memories can grow into large stories when told again and again. In the Greek world, many years after the Late Bronze Age had ended, storytellers began to shape these memories into long tales. They spoke of rulers, ships, and battles. They gave names to the leaders and filled the events with personal motives. Over time, the tale grew larger and more dramatic. This tale became known as the War at Troy. Even though the later story included many parts that were not historical, the seed of the tale came from real disputes and real struggles. It came from a time when Troy was an important city in a busy region. It came from a time when the Mycenaean world and the Hittite realm watched the same sea routes. It came from a time when no power could stand without careful choices and strong defenses. Today, when we look at the real history behind the tale, we can see how much the people of that age accomplished. They built strong walls, created tools, organized trade, and cared for their land. They lived through periods of calm and periods of danger. Their efforts shaped the region for many generations. When we view their world in a simple and calm way, we can see that the core of the later tale was formed by ordinary people who lived steady lives. They woke with the sun, worked with their hands, and rested at night. They lived with both hope and fear, just as people do today. Their story continues to speak to us because it began in real places, with real decisions and real struggles. As we move forward, we can picture the region in the years after the fall of many late Bronze Age kingdoms. The land did not become empty. People remained in their homes when they could. Others moved to new places. Villages shifted and trade routes changed. Life became simpler in many regions because larger systems had broken apart. Yet families continued to farm, fish, and raise animals. People still cooked simple meals, wove cloth, shaped pottery, and told stories during quiet evenings. In the area around Troy, the city did not vanish. The remains of the older fortifications still shaped the land. Some parts were repaired, while other parts were left as they were. The people who lived there used the structures that still stood. They cleaned rooms that survived damage. They built new shelters beside older walls. They used stones from fallen sections to make new paths or small storehouses. Life in such a place often moved in a cycle. In the early part of the day, people worked the fields. The soil in some valleys was good for grain, while other plots supported vines or small orchards. Animals grazed in open land outside the city. Women and men worked together to care for daily needs. Children learned simple tasks, such as carrying water, gathering kindling, or helping with animals. Inside the city, small workshops produced pottery for cooking, carrying water, and storing grain. Workers shaped clay by hand or with simple wheels. After forming the jars and bowls, they dried them and placed them in ovens to harden. The colors of the clay varied based on the soil and the fire. These vessels were not fine works of art. They were useful items for ordinary families. Trade still existed in this period, though it was far more limited than in earlier centuries. Small groups of traders traveled along the coast in short trips. They carried goods from one settlement to another. A trader might bring grain from inland farms to a fishing village that lacked good soil. Another trader might carry fish or salted meat to a place that needed food during winter months. These simple exchanges helped people survive even when larger systems had collapsed. During this period, memories of earlier conflicts remained strong. At night, families gathered around small fires. Elders told stories of past times, when rulers built great walls and ships traveled far across the sea. Many of these stories came from hints of real events. People remembered that Troy had faced attacks. They remembered that sailors from distant lands once crossed the water with strong aims. They remembered broken walls and lost homes. Over many retellings, the stories grew in detail. The Greek world, which had also passed through hardship during the same period, saw a slow return of stability. New communities formed where older centers had fallen. People built simpler homes but continued older customs. They raised sheep and goats, gathered olives where they grew, planted grain, and fished near the coast. Over time, some of these communities grew larger. They began to form a shared culture that admired stories of earlier times. As the generations passed, storytellers shaped tales of earlier rulers and their actions. They spoke of strong leaders who crossed the sea. They recalled a great city near the coast that stood in the path of important trade. They described a long conflict that brought many groups together. These early storytellers did not use written records for their work. They spoke from memory and imagination, using fragments of real history as a base. This storytelling tradition grew stronger as travel resumed between different Greek regions. Poets and singers visited gatherings, festivals, and markets. They recited tales that mixed memory and invention. People enjoyed hearing familiar stories shaped in new ways. The story of the conflict at Troy became one of the most repeated. Over time, it came to serve as a shared cultural memory of the earlier age. Yet behind these tales, Troy itself still stood. The city changed with each generation. Some layers show rebuilding with new homes that were more modest than the earlier grand structures. The people living there did not see themselves as part of a grand legend. They simply lived as they needed to. They planted crops, tended animals, and kept watch along the coast. They understood that the sea brought both opportunity and risk. The coastal plain near Troy offered space for grazing and farming. The nearby hills provided wood, stone, and fresh water from streams. Families carried water in clay jars, baked bread from ground grain, and cooked meals with herbs gathered from the countryside. Children ran through narrow lanes and played near the walls that had once protected the city. Life in such a place was modest but steady. In time, new visitors arrived in the region. Travelers from Greek communities came across the sea. They looked upon the land with curiosity and respect. Some travelers had heard stories about the earlier conflict at Troy. When they saw the old walls and the ruins of strong structures, they imagined scenes from the tales they knew. They linked the stories they had heard with the ruins that stood before them. This helped shape the way later generations understood the ancient past. These visits marked the beginning of a long association between Greek culture and the site of Troy. The city became a place where people connected real remains with imagined events. Over many generations, this connection grew stronger. The more the stories were told, the more people believed they described a single large conflict. The ruins of Troy became a symbol of that imagined war, even though real history showed a series of smaller events and long periods of rebuilding. As time moved forward, the region continued to change. New powers rose in Anatolia. The Greek world also grew in new ways, forming city-states that traded, explored, and built new forms of government. The story of the conflict at Troy became a key part of Greek culture. It gave people a sense of shared history. It helped them imagine the early days of their world. During this long process, the real site of Troy remained a quiet place. People still lived there, though the scale of the city was smaller than in earlier ages. Farmers continued to plow the land, and fishermen still worked near the coast. The remains of ancient walls were part of their daily view. They built new houses among stones that once supported grand structures. They walked paths that earlier generations had used for centuries. When later travelers arrived, they often asked local people about the ancient ruins. Local families may not have known details of the old conflicts, but they knew that the land held memory. They heard visitors speak with great interest about the ancient past. They saw that the ruins drew attention from distant places. This slow flow of visitors kept the memory of Troy alive across long periods of quiet life. In later centuries, as written history became more widespread, scholars began to wonder about the truth behind the tales. They studied the stories and compared them with known facts about trade, travel, and conflict. Some believed that the story of the conflict at Troy was mostly myth. Others suspected that real events had inspired the tale. Yet no one could be certain without physical evidence. This uncertainty lasted many centuries, but the land of Troy continued to hold its secrets. The soil covered old walls, pottery broke and settled into layers, and the remains of homes became part of the earth. Year after year, the land remained quiet as the world around it changed. Later, when scientific study grew stronger, researchers visited the region with new interest. They walked the ground, studied the hills, and compared the terrain with ancient descriptions. This renewed attention slowly prepared the way for a breakthrough in the study of Troy. The mound where Troy stood gave people a strong advantage. From the top, they could see the plain below, the sea in the distance, and the paths that led toward the city. This allowed them to notice travelers, traders, or strangers approaching. It also helped them plan how to protect their homes if there was a threat. The city walls were built from stone, thick and tall, to give safety and to mark the border of the settlement. Inside the city, streets were narrow and practical. Houses were close to one another, built with mud bricks, wood, and stones. Each home had a small courtyard where families could cook, store grain, and tend animals like goats or chickens. Many houses had workshops attached, where pots were shaped, cloth was woven, and simple tools were made or repaired. Life in these homes followed the seasons. Planting and harvesting, caring for animals, and storing food took most of the day. The people of Troy depended on the surrounding land for survival. The plains near the city were good for wheat and barley. Small orchards provided fruit and olives. Goats and sheep grazed on the hills, while cows could feed on open fields. Farmers used simple tools like wooden plows pulled by animals, and they carried water from streams to irrigate their crops. Life was not easy, but it allowed families to remain on the same land for many years. Trade also shaped daily life in Troy. The city was located on a path that connected the Aegean coast to inland regions. Traders brought metal pottery, cloth, and food. People exchanged goods not only with nearby settlements, but also with visitors from farther lands. Some of the goods traveled by ship, others by pack animals along narrow paths. Troy benefited from this contact because trade allowed access to materials and foods that could not be produced locally. The walls of Troy were a central part of the city. They were repaired and rebuilt several times over the centuries. Archaeologists have found evidence of fires and destruction in different layers of the mound, suggesting that the city faced attacks or accidents repeatedly. Each time, people rebuilt their homes and walls, sometimes in a simpler form, sometimes in a stronger version. These efforts show the determination of the inhabitants to remain on their land and to protect their families. In daily life, families had routines. Early in the morning, people would carry water from wells or streams. Bread was baked in small ovens, and meals were prepared from grain, vegetables, and occasional meat. Children learned from their parents, helping with chores and gathering materials for household work. Elders shared knowledge about farming, cooking, and survival. Everyone had a role in making the household function smoothly. The city also had workshops where craftsmen made important goods. Potters shaped clay for cooking, storage, and carrying water. Weavers used simple looms to make cloth for clothing and household use. Metalworkers shaped bronze tools, weapons, and ornaments. These workshops were close to homes, showing that work and daily life were closely connected. People often passed by or helped each other while moving through the narrow streets. Water was an important concern for Troy. Streams flowed near the city, and wells provided fresh water for drinking and cooking. Water had to be carefully managed, especially during dry seasons. Families collected and stored water in clay jars. They also used it for animals and for small gardens. Proper care of water sources was vital for the survival of the city. The surrounding hills provided materials for building. Stones were used to repair walls, make paths, or construct homes. Wood from nearby trees was used for beams, doors, and simple furniture. Clay from the soil was shaped into pots, bricks, and tiles. The combination of these materials allowed the city to grow and adapt to changing conditions over time. People of Troy were aware of the larger world around them. Ships passed along the coast, carrying goods and sometimes visitors. Travelers on foot or with carts moved along paths that connected different settlements. This brought news, new materials, and occasional tension. The city had to maintain relationships with neighbors, balancing trade, alliances, and defense. Religion and ritual were part of daily life. Families and communities observed simple practices to ensure safety, health, and prosperity. They may have left offerings at small shrines or followed routines tied to the seasons. Such practices help create a sense of order and connection to the land and community. Even during times of difficulty, Troy continued to grow in its own way. The city rebuilt after fires or attacks, families adapted to changes in trade, and people continued daily routines. The Mound of Troy, rising above the plain, became a place that held centuries of life, work, and human care. Each layer of the city tells a story of families who wanted to survive, to provide for their children, and to remain on their land. The repeated rebuilding shows that Troy was not a single moment of greatness, but a long history of ordinary life mixed with moments of tension. Walls were repaired, homes reshaped, and streets reorganized. Families adapted to conditions that sometimes changed suddenly due to weather, trade shifts, or attacks. This adaptability was part of the story of Troy as a real city. By looking at the layers of the city, archaeologists have learned about the people's diet, work, and daily habits. Remains of grain, animal bones, pottery, and tools reveal what families ate and how they worked. Simple finds like knives, weights, or weaving tools show how people organized their lives. Even small fragments help us picture the ordinary life that went on for generations. The Mound of Troy also shows evidence of social organization. Larger homes with more rooms were probably used by leaders or families of higher status. Smaller homes were used by ordinary families. Workshops, streets, and storage areas were carefully arranged. This organization helped the city function. It allowed people to work, trade, and defend their homes efficiently. Troy's location made it part of a network that connected distant regions. Traders from the Aegean Islands, the Greek mainland, and the inland Anatolian regions passed through or exchanged goods. Even if the city did not control all the trade, it benefited from its position. This connection kept the city alive and made it part of a larger story of human movement, work, and exchange. Over centuries, the memory of Troy grew beyond its walls. Travelers and storytellers linked the city with tales of long conflicts, strong leaders, and distant journeys. While the stories added dramatic elements, the real city remained the same, a place where people worked, lived, and adapted to the world around them. Its walls, streets, homes, and workshops continued to support life through generations. The calm view of Troy shows that cities grow not only through great events, but through the steady effort of people living day by day. They farmed the land, repaired homes, cared for children, maintained walls, and traded with neighbors. They faced challenges, yet they remained on the mound, building a life that future generations would remember, even when tales turned real events into legend. The Mound of Troy, rising above the plain, shows a long story of survival and adaptation. People rebuilt their homes many times. Each generation repaired walls, cleared streets, and shaped workshops. They planted crops and raised animals. They fetched water from streams and wells, cooked food, and stored grain for the months when farming was not possible. Daily life was full of practical tasks. Each day, people worked with their hands and relied on careful planning to keep families safe and fed. Houses in Troy varied in size. Some had several rooms where families cooked, slept, and stored goods. Others were smaller, with only one main room and a small courtyard. In these yards, children played while parents worked. Goats, sheep, and chickens roamed nearby, providing milk, eggs, and meat. People also kept dogs for protection and help in hunting or guarding animals. Each home was a small center of activity, and each family contributed to the city's overall life. Workshops were part of the city landscape. Potters shaped clay into jars, bowls, and storage containers. Weavers made cloth from wool and flax. Metalworkers shaped bronze into tools, knives, and simple ornaments. These items were practical and necessary. People relied on their skills to make daily life possible. Craftsmen often passed their knowledge to their children, ensuring that skills survived from one generation to the next. The city walls were a constant presence. Built from stone, they were repaired and strengthened over time. Archaeologists have found traces of damage from fire and attacks, which show that Troy faced dangers from both human and natural forces. Fires could have been caused by conflict or by accidents in homes or workshops. Each time, rebuilding was necessary to protect the people and preserve the city. Trade connected Troy to surrounding regions. Traders brought goods from the islands, from Greece, and from inland Anatolia. Metal, pottery, grain, and textiles passed through the city. These exchanges provided resources that could not be found locally. Trade also brought news. Stories of events from distant lands reached Troy through travelers, allowing the inhabitants to understand more about the wider world. Water was vital for survival. Streams and wells provided drinking water, water for cooking, and water for animals. During dry periods, families stored water in clay jars. They carefully managed supplies to ensure that there was enough for everyone. Proper water management helped the city survive in a region that sometimes faced dry seasons. The plain around Troy supported agriculture. Wheat and barley grew in the fertile soil. Olive trees and fruit trees provided food and oil. Animals grazed on open hills. Fields and pastures required daily attention. Families worked together to plant, harvest, and protect crops from animals. Farming was hard work, but it allowed people to live on the land for generations. Troy's location was strategic. The city overlooked a narrow water passage that connected the Aegean Sea to inland rivers. Ships passed by carrying goods and travelers. The city could observe these movements and protect its interests. This position also made Troy a target for groups who wanted to control trade routes or collect tolls. The city's walls and watch points were necessary to guard against these threats. Despite challenges, life in Troy continued steadily. Families followed routines. Children learned the skills they would need as adults. Adults tended fields, cared for animals, and worked in workshops. Older people shared knowledge and helped guide the community. Each generation added its own work to the city, slowly building the mound that archaeologists see today. Religion and daily rituals were part of life. Families may have left offerings or observed seasonal traditions. These actions helped create a sense of order and safety. They connected people to their land and to one another. Rituals were practical as well as symbolic, helping families maintain focus and cooperation. The mound of Troy preserves evidence of social organization. Larger homes with more rooms were likely occupied by leaders or families of higher status. Smaller homes belonged to ordinary families. Workshops, streets, and storage areas were organized to make city life functional. This arrangement shows how people managed their community, balancing work, living space, and safety. Archaeological discoveries reveal the city's diet and material life. Grain, animal bones, pottery fragments, and tools show what people ate and how they worked. Knives, weights, and weaving implements indicate daily activities. Even small artifacts help reconstruct the rhythm of life in the city. The city's repeated rebuilding shows the resilience of its people. Walls were repaired, homes reshaped, and streets reorganized. Families adapted to changing conditions, whether from weather, trade, or attacks. This adaptability was central to the long history of Troy as a living city, not just a site of legendary battles. Troy's place in regional trade networks made it part of a wider story. Traders from islands, Greece, and Anatolia brought new materials, foods, and ideas. Even though the city did not control all trade, it benefited from its position. Its location allowed it to thrive through practical connections and exchange. Over time, memories of Troy's past grew in the surrounding regions. Travelers and storytellers connected the city with tales of conflict and journeys. While stories added drama, the real city continued its practical life farming, raising animals, crafting goods, and protecting homes. Its walls and streets supported generations of people. The mound preserves centuries of ordinary life mixed with moments of tension. People repaired homes, maintained walls, and adapted to changes in trade and security. Each layer shows the effort of families determined to survive and care for their children. Their work created a living city that persisted through challenges. Daily routines in Troy followed natural rhythms. Sunrise marked the start of work fetching water, tending animals, cooking meals, and preparing fields. Children helped with chores and learned skills from parents. Women and men often worked together to manage households and small workshops. Even simple tasks like grinding grain or weaving cloth were essential for survival. Food was central to daily life. Grain from fields became bread or porridge. Fruit, vegetables, and olives supplemented meals. Meat from animals raised on nearby hills provided protein. Fish and seafood were also available from the coast. Families stored food to prepare for periods when supplies were limited. Trade brought access to goods not available locally. Clay for pottery, metals for tools, and rare items like incense or fine cloth arrived from distant regions. Traders and travelers carried news from other lands, which allowed Troy's inhabitants to understand the wider world. These connections strengthened the city and helped it adapt. Workshops were vital for the city's functioning. Potters shaped vessels for cooking and storage. Weavers made cloth for clothing and household use. Metalworkers shaped bronze into tools, knives, and ornaments. Craftsmen passed skills to their children, keeping knowledge alive through generations. Defense remained a concern. The city walls and gates were maintained to protect against threats. Observation points allowed residents to monitor the plain and the sea. Fires, attacks, and natural hazards meant vigilance was necessary. The walls and watch points were practical tools, not symbols of legend. Even as the centuries passed, Troy remained a place of steady human life. Daily routines, work, and family care continued despite changes in trade, weather, or politics. The mound itself grew higher as generations rebuilt, creating the layered city that we study today. This long effort of ordinary people is the real story behind the later tales of wars and heroes. Troy's long history shows how human life continues through cycles of work, adaptation, and rebuilding. Ordinary tasks like planting, cooking, weaving, and repairing homes formed the backbone of the city. Each generation added to the city's life, preserving it for the future. The combination of strategic location, fertile land, and practical work allowed Troy to survive through centuries. Families managed resources carefully, repaired damage from attacks or accidents, and continued daily routines. Their efforts ensured that the city remained occupied and functioning through long periods of change. In this way, Troy was more than a story of conflict. It was a living city shaped by ordinary life, work, and resilience. Each stone jar and tool tells a piece of this story. Each layer of the mound preserves the efforts of families who sought to survive, protect their homes, and provide for their children. Their lives created the foundation for the later memory of Troy as a famous city, remembered long after the events themselves. Troy was an important city in the late Bronze Age. It was built on a mound above the plain, near the coast of what is now northwest Turkey. Its location made it valuable. Ships traveling along the coast could be seen from the city walls. Traders and travelers passed by, bringing goods and news. The city's position also brought risks. Any group that wanted control of trade routes might try to attack. The people of Troy had to balance daily life with the need to protect their homes. The city was not a single building or palace. It was a community of homes, workshops, streets, and walls. Families lived close together. Courtyards allowed cooking, working, and small gardens. Children helped with chores, learned practical skills, and played near their homes. Animals were part of daily life. Goats, sheep, cows, and chickens provided food, milk, and other resources. Dogs helped guard the home and animals. Life followed the seasons, with planting, harvesting, and caring for animals marking the passing months. Trade was central to Troy's survival. The city connected the coastal sea route to inland regions. Traders brought metal, cloth, pottery, and food. In exchange, people of Troy sent goods produced locally. Trade provided access to materials that could not be made or grown in the city. Even when trade slowed because of conflict or weather, the community adapted. They stored surplus grain and maintained local production to survive. The city walls were built with large stones. They were repaired and strengthened over many generations. Archaeologists have found layers showing fire, destruction, and rebuilding. These layers indicate that Troy faced repeated challenges. Fires may have come from accidents or attacks. Each rebuilding effort shows that people were determined to remain on their land and care for their families. Life inside the walls was practical. Families baked bread, cooked meals, and stored grain. Workshops produced clay pots, woven cloth, and bronze tools. Potters shaped vessels for cooking and storage. Weavers produced textiles for clothing and home use. Metalworkers shaped bronze into knives, tools, and ornaments. Knowledge passed from parents to children, keeping skills alive over generations. Water management was important. Streams ran near the city, and wells supplied drinking water. Clay jars stored water during dry periods. Families carefully divided water for cooking, animals, and gardens. Adequate water was essential for survival. The city relied on nearby hills and plains for food. Crops such as wheat and barley grew in the fertile fields. Olive trees and fruit trees supplied food and oil. Animals grazed hills and pastures, supporting daily needs. The memory of earlier conflicts was present in daily life. Even when life was calm, people remembered that Troy had faced attacks. Stories were told about ships crossing the water and cities struggling for control. These memories helped families understand the importance of defending their homes and walls. They also shaped the traditions passed to children about caution, work, and community. Troy's history is part of a larger world. Across the sea, Mycenaean kingdoms in Greece were active in trade and politics. Palaces and centers controlled nearby regions. Records show that the Hittite Empire, farther inland, also monitored the area. Letters mention a city called Wilusa, believed to be an older form of Troy. Correspondence between Hittites and Mycenaean leaders shows that the region had disputes over land, trade, and influence. These tensions set the stage for the stories later told about the Trojan War. Evidence from archaeology supports these connections. Layers of the city show destruction and rebuilding during the same period that the Mycenaean world and Hittite Empire were active. This suggests that Troy experienced real threats and pressure. The combination of trade importance, strategic location, and surrounding powers created a situation in which conflict was likely. The later story called the Trojan War grew from these historical circumstances. Poets added heroes, leaders, and long battles, but the real city lived a steady life. Families tended fields, raised animals, worked in workshops, and repaired homes. They observed seasons, managed water, and defended their city. Troy was not only a place of war, it was a place of work, learning, and care. Even in times of tension, daily life continued. People woke with the sun. They worked in the fields or workshops, prepared meals, and cared for children and elders. They gathered water, maintained homes, and preserved grain. These routines were essential for survival. They also created the conditions that allowed the city to remain occupied through many generations. The mound of Troy preserved centuries of life. Each layer of the city tells a story of rebuilding and adaptation. Fires, attacks, and natural events required repair. Streets were cleared and homes reconstructed. Workshops were reopened, and trade continued when possible. Families continued routines of farming, cooking, weaving, and metalworking. These ordinary acts allowed the city to endure. Trade and travel continued to connect Troy with the wider region. Traders from islands, the Greek mainland, and inland Anatolia brought goods and information. People exchanged metal, pottery, textiles, and food. These contacts strengthened the city. They also brought awareness of the outside world. Families knew that distant powers influenced their lives, even if indirectly. The walls of Troy were practical tools for survival. They marked boundaries, defended against attacks, and gave residents confidence. Observation points allowed people to see the plain and the approaching sea. From these points, families could react to visitors, traders, or potential threats. The walls were repaired regularly, showing ongoing care and concern. Daily life included work and skill learning. Children helped adults with chores and learned essential skills. Potters, weavers, and metal workers trained apprentices, often family members. These skills allowed the city to produce tools, household items, and trade goods. Work was practical, not decorative. Survival depended on these abilities. Water, food, and land remained priorities. Wells and streams supplied drinking water. Grain and vegetables fed families. Animals provided milk, meat, and wool. Gardens, orchards, and pastures required daily care. These resources supported both ordinary life and resilience during difficult periods. Troy's history is not only about survival, but also about connection. The city was part of a network linking the Aegean coast, islands, and inland regions. People from Troy traded, traveled, and shared news with distant lands. These connections allowed the city to adapt to changing conditions. Even when larger powers declined, the city could continue through local work and relationships. The mound itself became a record of generations. Stone walls, broken pottery, clay jars, and tools reveal centuries of life. Every repair and addition reflects the effort of families who lived there. The city's structure preserved the ordinary work of daily life as much as it preserved evidence of occasional conflicts. The story of Troy, which later became the tale of the Trojan War, is rooted in this real history. People lived ordinary lives under conditions that were sometimes difficult. They adapted, rebuilt, and worked to survive. Later stories added dramatic battles and famous leaders. Yet the foundation of these stories was the long, continuous life of the city and its people. The mound reminds us that history is made in small, practical ways. Planting crops, tending animals, shaping pottery, and repairing walls were as important as any battle. Each act allowed families to remain in their homes and preserve their community. The repeated rebuilding created a lasting city that could be remembered centuries later. The importance of Troy was not only in its walls or its trade routes, but in the people who lived there. Families maintained routines, skills, and social order. Children learned from elders. Craft skills were preserved. Daily tasks kept the city functioning. These ordinary actions made Troy an enduring settlement, capable of surviving centuries of change and influence from neighboring powers. Even when the larger Bronze Age world changed, when Mycenaean palaces fell, when the Hittite Empire declined, and when trade slowed, Troy remained. The city adapted, showing resilience in ordinary life. These centuries of persistence created a foundation for the later memory of the Trojan War, linking real events to the stories that would be told in the Greek world for generations. The city of Troy continued to grow and change over many centuries. Each generation of people added their work and care to the mound. When fires or attacks damaged homes, families rebuilt. When fields failed or trade slowed, people adapted by storing grain, raising more animals, or crafting more tools. This daily attention allowed the city to remain occupied and functional over long periods. Life in Troy was not constant excitement or conflict. It was steady work, observation, and care, mixed with moments of challenge. The walls of Troy were central to its survival. They were built to protect homes, streets, and workshops. Archaeologists have found evidence that the walls were repaired many times, showing the city's ongoing concern for defense. Observation points along the walls allowed people to see the surrounding plain and the sea. This view was crucial. Traders, travelers, or potential attackers could be seen from a distance, giving families and leaders time to respond. The walls were practical, not symbolic, and they reflected the city's need to remain safe in a region where power shifted frequently. Inside the city, streets were narrow and practical, lined with houses, workshops, and storage areas. Each home had a courtyard where families cooked meals, stored food, and tended small gardens. Children helped with chores, learning practical skills from their parents. Adults managed farms, cared for animals, or worked in workshops. Goats, sheep, and chickens provided milk, meat, and eggs, while cows were raised for food and labor. Dogs helped guard both homes and animals. Life followed a rhythm set by work, seasons, and necessity. Workshops were a vital part of the city. Potters shaped clay into vessels for cooking, carrying water, and storing grain. Weavers created cloth from wool and flax. Metalworkers shaped bronze into knives, tools, and simple ornaments. Knowledge was passed down through families, ensuring skills survived for generations. These crafts were practical, helping the city maintain daily life, trade, and self-sufficiency. Water management was crucial. Streams and wells provided fresh water, which families stored in clay jars for dry periods. Water was used for cooking animals and small gardens. Careful management was necessary to ensure survival. Farmers relied on fertile land, planting wheat, barley, and vegetables. Olive and fruit trees added food and oil. Pastures and hills allowed animals to graze, supplying meat, milk, and wool. The city's survival depended on careful use of these resources. Trade connected Troy to the wider region. Goods came from islands, the Greek mainland, and inland Anatolia. Metal, pottery, textiles, and food were exchanged. Trade allowed access to materials not available locally and brought information about distant regions. Even when trade slowed, families adapted by producing more locally. These exchanges helped the city remain alive and aware of the outside world. Memories of earlier conflicts shaped daily life. Even when the city was not under threat, families remembered that Troy had faced attacks. These stories helped people understand the importance of defending homes and walls. They also became part of the culture passed down to children, teaching caution, care, and cooperation. Over generations, these memories grew, eventually forming the basis of the later story known as the Trojan War. The larger world influenced Troy. Across the sea, Mycenaean kingdoms in Greece controlled palaces, towns, and islands. Farther inland, the Hittite Empire monitored coastal regions. Letters from Hittite kings mention Wilusa, believed to be Troy, and disputes with leaders from the Mycenaean world. These tensions show that Troy existed in a region of complex relationships, with trade, diplomacy, and occasional conflict shaping daily life. Archaeology supports the idea of real events behind later tales. Layers of Troy show evidence of fire, destruction, and rebuilding. These layers correspond to the period when Mycenaean powers and the Hittite Empire were active. While we cannot know exactly what happened in each instance, the city clearly faced threats and adapted repeatedly. The later story of the Trojan War grew from these circumstances. The mound itself preserves centuries of human activity. Every layer, from homes to workshops to walls, tells a story of ordinary life. Families baked bread, prepared meals, stored grain, tended gardens, and repaired homes. Children learned skills for future work, and adults maintained the city's practical needs. These daily acts allowed the city to endure through centuries of change and influence, even when larger powers declined. The Mycenaean palaces fell, the Hittite Empire weakened, and trade routes shifted. Troy continued. The city adapted to new conditions. Families rebuilt homes, repaired walls, and maintained workshops. Life continued with attention to practical needs. Troy's survival relied on ordinary acts repeated over generations: planting, harvesting, crafting, and protecting homes. The city's position was strategic. From the mound, residents could observe the sea and the plain. Traders and travelers passed by, bringing goods and news. The location also made Troy a potential target. Groups seeking control of trade routes or wealth could attempt attacks. The city's walls, watch points, and careful observation allowed residents to respond. Defense and vigilance were part of daily life. Daily routines provided stability. Sunrise marked work in the fields or workshops. Meals were prepared, water fetched, animals tended. Children helped and learned skills. Adults balanced work, household management, and protection of the city. Older residents shared knowledge and guided decisions. These routines created the steady life that allowed Troy to survive when larger powers around it faced collapse. Archaeologists have found evidence of the city's diet and production. Grain remains, animal bones, pottery fragments, and tools show what people ate and how they worked. Knives, weights, weaving tools, and fragments of bronze indicate daily tasks and practical skills. Even small artifacts help reconstruct the rhythm of life and the effort required to maintain the city. The city's layers show social organization. Larger homes with multiple rooms were likely occupied by leaders or high-status families. Smaller homes belonged to ordinary families. Streets, workshops, and storage areas were arranged to support both daily life and community needs. This organization ensured that the city could function efficiently and safely. The Mound of Troy preserves the ordinary and extraordinary. Families maintained homes, worked fields, cared for children, and adapted to change. The walls and streets show concern for protection and practical living. Rebuilding after fire or attack shows determination to survive. These repeated efforts created a foundation for the stories later told about the city. Over centuries, the memory of Troy expanded beyond its walls. Travelers and storytellers linked the city to tales of conflict, ships, and journeys. While stories added heroes and drama, the city's real life was steady work and care. Trade, daily chores, workshops, and defense made Troy a living settlement. Its endurance reflects generations of people maintaining home, family, and community. The mound tells a story of human resilience. Ordinary acts, planting, weaving, cooking, tending animals, were as important as defense. These acts allowed families to survive, preserve knowledge, and maintain social organization. The mound itself became a record of persistence, showing how life in Troy continued through centuries of challenge. Troy's long history shows that the foundation of later tales of the Trojan War was ordinary life. Work, care, observation, and adaptation kept the city alive. Families repaired walls, maintained workshops, farmed the land, and passed knowledge to children. This practical daily life created a settlement that could endure through time, even as outside powers rose and fell. The story of Troy is not only about war, but about generations of people living, surviving, and shaping their city. The events that inspired what later became the story of the Trojan War began with tensions between Troy and the Greek kingdoms across the sea. Troy was an important city, controlling trade routes and overseeing goods that traveled from the islands to inland regions. Wealth, access to trade, and alliances made Troy a valuable place. Greek leaders, whose palaces controlled nearby islands and coasts, may have seen Troy as a rival or a target for influence. Letters from the Hittite Empire mention a city called Wilusa, believed to be Troy, and conflicts with rulers in the Greek world. These letters show that disputes over land, resources, and trade were real. While no single war as described in later stories can be confirmed, it is clear that Troy was part of a network of political tensions. Threats, raids, and disputes were part of life, making conflict possible. The later story of the Trojan War took these tensions and shaped them into a long tale of conflict between Troy and the Greek kingdoms. Archaeology suggests that the city experienced destruction at different periods, sometimes from fire or attack. These real events may have inspired stories of battle, ships, and leaders crossing the sea. The city's walls were crucial during these conflicts. People repaired and reinforced them whenever danger arose. Observation points allowed residents to watch for approaching ships or travelers. Defense was practical. Families could respond to attacks, secure homes, and protect resources. Walls were maintained for generations, reflecting the ongoing need for vigilance. Inside the city, daily life continued even during times of tension. Families worked the fields, cared for animals, and produced tools and goods in workshops. Children learned practical skills and elders guided households. People adapted to challenges, whether from weather, trade, or potential conflict. Survival depended on careful organization and cooperation among families. The surrounding plain and hills provided resources for both daily life and defense. Crops like wheat and barley were planted in fertile fields. Olive trees and orchards supplied food and oil. Animals grazed on hills, providing milk, meat, and wool. Families could gather resources from the land to support themselves in times of threat. Water from streams and wells was carefully stored and managed. Trade remained important even during tension. Merchants and travelers continued to pass by, bringing goods and information. Metal, pottery, and textiles were exchanged, and local products were sent outward. Troy's position on the coast allowed it to control access to trade routes. These exchanges made the city valuable, which may have attracted the attention of neighboring powers and created situations that later became part of the story of war. Historical evidence shows that Troy faced attacks at certain periods. Layers of the city reveal fire, destruction, and rebuilding. These events may not have been a single war lasting years, but rather a series of conflicts and tensions over time. Families and leaders responded to threats by repairing homes and walls, storing food, and maintaining the city's defenses. These practical responses were the reality behind the later tales of heroes and battles. The later story, called the Trojan War, emphasizes leaders, ships, and battles, but the historical basis was long-term tension and periodic conflict. Troy's importance in trade, strategic location, and connections to the Greek world created conditions in which disputes could escalate. These disputes may have involved small-scale attacks, raiding parties, or political pressure rather than one continuous, legendary war. Despite these challenges, Troy remained occupied and functional. Families continued daily routines, repaired homes, cared for animals, and produced goods. Children learned skills that allowed the city to survive over generations. Workshops and trades were maintained. Water, food, and defense remained priorities. This daily effort created a stable life, even when threats loomed. Archaeological layers show periods of destruction, followed by careful rebuilding. Walls were repaired, streets cleared, and homes reconstructed. Pottery and tools were remade. These practical acts allowed the city to survive long-term threats and maintain its role as a regional center. Over centuries, these repeated events created the memory of conflict that later storytellers shaped into the tale of the Trojan War. Communication between Troy and Greek kingdoms also played a role. Letters and records from the Hittite Empire suggest that Walusa, Troy, had disputes with rulers across the sea. These disputes may have involved land, trade rights, or alliances. While the details are limited, they show that Troy was engaged in political and economic struggles beyond the city itself. Families in Troy experienced the impact of these tensions in everyday life. People repaired homes after attacks, stored food to prepare for uncertainty, and watched travelers arriving from the sea. Daily work like planting, weaving, and tending animals became intertwined with vigilance. These practical efforts allowed Troy to remain a functioning settlement despite the pressures around it. Trade and observation were also part of defense. Ships passing along the coast brought goods, news, and sometimes threats. From the city's walls, residents could track the movement of these ships. Traders provided resources that strengthened the city, while observation helped detect potential dangers. These activities were part of life, shaping how the city responded to tension without requiring continuous fighting. The Mound of Troy preserves centuries of human activity, showing both ordinary life and moments of conflict. Layers of homes, workshops, streets, and walls illustrate daily work, repair, and adaptation. Tools, pottery, and storage containers reveal how families survived, produced goods, and maintained routines. Every layer demonstrates a combination of practical living and preparedness for danger. Over generations, these repeated periods of tension, defense, and daily work created the foundation for the story of the Trojan War. Later storytellers added drama, naming leaders, armies, and battles. But the real history behind the tale was a series of challenges that required families to rebuild, adapt, and protect their city. Troy's importance in trade and strategic location made conflict likely. Even as tensions rose and attacks occurred, ordinary life continued. Meals were prepared from local crops and animal products. Workshops produced necessary tools and vessels. Children learned from their parents, and elders guided decision-making. Water was stored, fields maintained, and walls repaired. These steady acts were the foundation that allowed Troy to persist, creating the real story behind the legendary war. The mound itself is a record of human resilience. Each layer shows repair, adaptation, and care. Families rebuilt homes after fires, maintained walls, and continued farming and trade. These acts of everyday life allowed Troy to remain an active city, while surrounded by political and economic pressures. The combination of ordinary life and repeated defense created the city remembered in stories of war. The historical Trojan War, as it likely happened, was not a single event lasting 10 years as later stories claim. Instead, it was a series of disputes, small attacks, and ongoing tension between Troy and the Greek kingdoms across the sea. Archaeological evidence, combined with Hittite records and trade connections, shows that Troy faced threats, defended itself, and adapted through centuries of practical effort. Troy's survival depended on ordinary people performing ordinary tasks with care and attention. Farming, tending animals, crafting, repairing, and observing the sea were all essential. These acts preserved the city through periods of conflict, creating the foundation for the memory of the Trojan War. The legendary war grew from these real events, amplified and shaped by storytellers over generations. The events that inspired the story of the Trojan War were connected to the city's position and wealth. Troy controlled trade routes between the Aegean Sea and inland regions, which made it valuable and sometimes a target. Greek kingdoms across the sea may have wanted influence or control over this trade. Disputes over resources, alliances, and access to trade routes created tension that could escalate into conflict. These conditions form the historical foundation for what later storytellers called the Trojan War. Archaeological evidence shows layers of destruction at Troy, some of which may correspond to conflicts with external forces. These events were not a single long war, but likely several attacks or periods of tension over many years. Families repaired homes, rebuilt walls, and stored food to survive each episode. Workshops continued to produce pottery, tools, and textiles, ensuring that daily life could carry on even under threat. Trade and contact with other regions were central to the city's significance. Ships passed along the coast, carrying goods, travelers, and news. Troy could observe these movements from its walls and watchtowers. Trade brought materials like metal, pottery, and textiles, which were not available locally. Access to these goods gave the city strength and influence, but also made it a target for neighboring powers. Conflicts over trade may have inspired parts of the later story of the Trojan War. The walls of Troy were essential during these periods of tension. Thick stone walls marked the city's boundary and provided protection. Observation points allowed residents to see approaching ships and travelers, giving families time to respond to potential danger. The walls were repaired and reinforced repeatedly, showing the city's long-term concern for safety. Defense was a practical part of life, not only a response to war, but a daily necessity. Inside the walls, families maintained routines even under threat. People worked in the fields, cared for animals, and managed workshops. Children learned skills that would be essential in adulthood, such as weaving, pottery, or farming. Adults balanced household tasks with community responsibilities, such as repairing walls or helping neighbors. Elders guided decisions and passed down knowledge. These routines helped the city remain functional, even during challenging times. The surrounding landscape supported Troy's survival. Fertile fields allowed crops like wheat and barley to grow. Olive and fruit trees provided food and oil. Hills and pastures offered grazing for goats, sheep, and cows. Water from streams and wells was stored in clay jars to ensure a steady supply. These practical resources allowed families to endure periods of scarcity or conflict. Daily work in agriculture and animal care was essential to the city's resilience. Archaeological discoveries also show evidence of workshops and crafts. Potters shaped clay into vessels for storage, cooking, and carrying water. Weavers produced cloth from wool and flax. Metalworkers shaped bronze into tools, knives, and ornaments. These workshops were essential for daily life and trade. Skills were passed from parents to children, ensuring continuity and survival over generations. Disputes between Troy and Greek kingdoms likely involved both trade and political influence. Letters from the Hittite Empire mention Walusa, identified as Troy, and conflicts with leaders across the sea. These disputes may have involved land, trade routes, or alliances. Even if no single war took place exactly as later stories describe, these tensions were real and shaped life in the city. The Mound of Troy preserves evidence of these conflicts. Layers of destruction show fire, rebuilding, and adaptation. Homes were reconstructed, streets cleared, and workshops reopened. Families stored grain, maintained walls, and repaired tools. Daily life continued alongside preparation for possible attacks. These practical responses were the reality behind the later tales of battles, ships, and legendary leaders. Even during periods of tension, trade and communication continued. Ships brought goods and news. Traders exchanged metal pottery and textiles. Local products were sent outward. These connections strengthened the city and helped it adapt to changing conditions. They also made Troy a place that others wanted to influence or control, which contributed to the historical basis of conflict. The city's social organization helped it endure. Larger homes likely belonged to leaders or high-status families, while smaller homes housed ordinary families. Streets, workshops, and storage areas were arranged to support daily life and defense. Coordination between families and leaders allowed the city to respond efficiently to threats and maintain its resources. Troy's residents also observed and adapted to the wider world. The city was part of a network of Greek kingdoms, Anatolian centers, and island communities. Political, economic, and social pressures from these regions influenced Troy. Awareness of the larger context helped families and leaders make practical decisions, from trade and defense to the management of daily life. The real events that inspired the story of the Trojan War were therefore a combination of practical tensions, occasional attacks, and long-term pressure from regional powers. Troy's strategic location and control of trade routes made conflict likely. The repeated destruction and rebuilding visible in the archaeological record reflect this reality. The city's survival depended on ordinary people performing everyday tasks while also preparing for potential danger. Daily life continued alongside these pressures. Meals were prepared from grain, vegetables, and animal products. Children helped with chores and learned skills from parents. Workshops produced essential items, and families maintained their homes and walls. Water and food were carefully managed. These acts of ordinary life were as important as defense in preserving the city and its community. The Mound of Troy records centuries of human effort. Each layer of homes, streets, walls, and workshops shows adaptation and persistence. Families rebuilt after fires, repaired damage, and continued daily routines. These actions created continuity, allowing the city to survive through periods of tension, decline of nearby powers, and changing trade networks. The city remained a functioning settlement for generations. Later storytellers transformed these real historical events into a long tale of war, heroes, and legendary leaders. Battles, armies, and famous names were added, but the foundation of the story came from Troy's actual history, a city that faced repeated challenges, defended itself, and adapted over centuries. The legendary war grew from the practical and steady life of ordinary people in Troy. Even as the story became famous, the real city was maintained through simple actions. Daily work, repair of walls, careful management of resources, and attention to trade allowed Troy to survive. Families worked together to ensure that homes, workshops, and fields remained functional. Children learned skills, and elders guided decisions. This combination of ordinary life and long-term adaptation preserved the city and inspired the later legendary tale of the Trojan War. Troy's story is preserved in layers of earth, stone, and artifacts. Each layer tells a piece of the city's history. Archaeologists have carefully studied these layers to understand the real events behind what later became the story of the Trojan War. Some layers show evidence of fire and destruction. Homes were burned, walls collapsed, and workshops were damaged. These layers correspond to periods when Troy likely faced attacks from external groups. Other layers show rebuilding, repair, and adaptation. Families restored homes, repaired walls, and reopened workshops. They planted crops, raised animals, and continued daily routines. This cycle of destruction and repair was part of the city's long history. The Mound of Troy contains multiple city levels. Troy VI and Troy VI are especially important. Troy VI shows strong walls, large houses, and evidence of wealth. Scholars believe it was a flourishing city with trade connections across the Aegean and inland regions. Troy Via shows signs of destruction, possibly from conflict or attack, followed by rebuilding. These layers reflect the challenges faced by the city and the resilience of its people. Evidence from pottery, tools, and household items helps reconstruct daily life. Clay jars stored water and grain. Pottery for cooking and storage was made locally, while some imported vessels came from other regions. Metal tools and weapons indicate that Troy was prepared for both work and defense. Weaving implements and remnants of cloth show that families produced their own clothing and textiles. These artifacts reveal a city that was both practical and connected to broader trade networks. Trade was essential for Troy. Ships carried goods along the coast and to nearby islands. Traders brought metal, pottery, and textiles. Local products were sent outward in exchange. This exchange allowed the city to obtain materials that were not available locally. Control of these trade routes gave Troy strategic importance. It also created tensions with neighboring regions and Greek kingdoms across the sea, which may have contributed to conflicts that later became the basis of the Trojan War. The walls of Troy were carefully constructed. Thick stone walls surrounded the city, with gates and watch points. These allowed residents to monitor the surrounding plain and the sea. Observation was practical. Families could see approaching traders, travelers, or potential attackers. Repairs and reinforcement of walls occurred repeatedly over generations, showing that defense was a continuous concern. The walls were not only for protection, but also a marker of the city's presence and organization. Daily life continued alongside these challenges. Families worked in fields, tending wheat, barley, olives, and fruit trees. Animals grazed on hills and pastures, providing milk, meat, and wool. Children helped with chores and learned practical skills. Adults balanced household work with responsibilities for defense, workshops, and trade. Elders guided decisions, passing down knowledge about farming, crafting, and managing resources. This steady rhythm of life allowed the city to endure through periods of tension. Workshops were central to Troy's economy. Potters shaped clay into cooking and storage vessels. Weavers produced cloth for clothing and household use. Metalworkers created tools, knives, and ornaments from bronze. Skills were transmitted through families, ensuring that knowledge continued across generations. Workshops also supported trade, producing goods that could be exchanged with other regions. Water management was vital. Streams and wells supplied fresh water. Clay jars stored water for dry periods. Families carefully divided water for cooking, animals, and gardens. Adequate water allowed crops and animals to survive, which in turn supported human life. Water management was part of everyday planning, and its importance increased during times of tension or attack. Evidence of conflict appears in the archaeological record. Burned layers, collapsed walls, and damaged homes suggest that Troy faced attacks. These events were likely smaller, scale conflicts rather than the continuous, decade-long war described in later stories, families responded by rebuilding and maintaining daily life. This cycle of destruction and recovery illustrates the practical reality behind the legendary tales. Trade and communication continued even during periods of tension. Ships and travelers brought goods, materials, and information. Metal, pottery, and textiles moved through Troy, while local products were exchanged outward. These networks connected the city to distant regions, helping it adapt to changing political and economic conditions. Trade strengthened Troy and made it influential in the region, but it also attracted attention and created potential for conflict. The social structure of the city supported resilience. Larger homes with multiple rooms likely housed leaders or high-status families. Smaller homes belonged to ordinary families. Streets, workshops, and storage areas were organized to ensure that daily life and defense could function efficiently. Cooperation among families and leaders helped the city survive challenges. Each member of the community had roles and responsibilities that contributed to the city's endurance. Even in times of pressure, daily life provided continuity. Meals were prepared from local crops and animal products. Children helped with chores and learned skills. Workshops produced essential items for survival and trade. Homes and walls were maintained. Water and food were carefully managed. These ordinary acts were as crucial as defense in preserving the city and its community. The Mound of Troy preserves centuries of effort. Each layer of homes, walls, streets, and workshops shows adaptation, repair, and care. Families rebuilt after fire or attack. They repaired walls, cleared streets, and restored workshops. Daily routines continued alongside preparation for possible threats. This combination of ordinary life and attention to defense allowed the city to persist and become a place remembered in legend. The historical events behind the story of the Trojan War were shaped by these conditions. Troy's strategic location, control of trade routes, and wealth created tension with neighboring powers. Attacks, disputes, and political pressure were part of the city's reality. Families and leaders responded with practical measures, repairing walls, maintaining resources, and continuing daily life. These efforts form the foundation of the later story of the Trojan War. Over generations, repeated periods of tension and adaptation created the memory that later storytellers used. Fires, destruction, and rebuilding left a record in the city's layers. Daily work, trade, and care for family and community created continuity. These ordinary acts preserved Troy's life while conflicts arose. Later, storytellers added battles, heroes, and drama, turning historical reality into the legendary Trojan War. Even as the legendary story grew, Troy remained a living city. Families repaired homes, maintained walls, worked in workshops, farmed the land, and cared for children and animals. Trade continued when possible. Observing the sea and plain was part of everyday life. These practical actions allowed the city to survive through generations, creating the foundation for both historical understanding and later myth. The Mound of Troy shows that the real story behind the Trojan War is not only about fighting. It is about survival, adaptation, and ordinary life under pressure. Daily work, repair, defense, trade, and learning skills allowed the city to endure. Families passed knowledge from one generation to the next. The combination of resilience, observation, and practical living preserved Troy through periods of conflict and change. Archaeology allows us to see both destruction and continuity. Layers of homes, walls, streets, and workshops show practical responses to events. Families adapted to fire, attack, or changing political circumstances. Workshops produced tools and vessels. Fields and animals were tended. Water was carefully managed. These ordinary acts ensured survival and stability. They created the foundation for the legendary stories of the Trojan War. The Mound of Troy contains many layers, each representing a period of settlement, growth, destruction, and rebuilding. Archaeologists have identified at least 9 major levels, from Troy I at the bottom to Troy IX at the top. The layers that are most important for understanding the events that inspired the Trojan War are Troy VI and Troy VII. Troy VI was a flourishing city with strong walls, large houses, and workshops. Families lived in well-organized homes, worked the fields, raised animals, and maintained trade connections with nearby regions and distant islands. Evidence shows that the city had access to metal, pottery, and textiles, both locally produced and imported. This access to resources made Troy a strong and influential city. Troy VI had thick stone walls that protected the city. These walls had gates and observation points, allowing residents to see the surrounding plain and the nearby sea. Families could watch travelers, traders, and approaching ships. The walls were practical tools for safety, giving the city time to prepare if a threat appeared. The design of the walls also suggests careful planning and knowledge of construction techniques. Homes were built from stone, mud bricks, and timber. Streets were narrow and organized to connect households, workshops, and storage areas efficiently. Workshops played a central role in city life. Potters shaped clay into vessels for cooking, storing food, and carrying water. Weavers produced cloth from wool and flax, which was used for clothing and household purposes. Metalworkers shaped bronze into knives, tools, and simple ornaments. These workshops allowed the city to meet its daily needs and engage in trade with other regions. Children learned practical skills in these workshops, often from their parents. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next helped the city survive through time. Trade was essential for Troy's survival and influence. The city was located near a narrow water passage connecting the Aegean Sea to inland rivers. Ships passed close to the city, carrying goods and people. Troy exported local products such as grain, olive oil, and textiles, while importing metals, pottery, and materials not found locally. These trade connections strengthened the city and made it strategically valuable. At the same time, the city's wealth and location attracted attention from neighboring regions and Greek kingdoms across the sea, creating tension and potential for conflict. Troy VI is the layer most associated with destruction and possible conflict. Evidence shows that homes and workshops were damaged, walls were partially collapsed, and fires left traces in the soil. Families responded by repairing and rebuilding, but the damage shows that the city faced serious threats. This layer may correspond to historical events that later became the basis for the story of the Trojan War. While we cannot confirm the details of a single long war, the destruction indicates that Troy was involved in significant conflict during this period. Daily life continued alongside these challenges. Families worked the fields, tending wheat, barley, and vegetables. Olive and fruit trees supplied food and oil. Animals grazed hills and pastures, providing meat, milk, and wool. Children helped with chores and learned practical skills. Adults balanced household tasks with responsibilities for defense, workshops, and trade. Elders guided decisions, passing knowledge about survival, farming, and crafting. This rhythm of life allowed the city to function even under pressure. Water management was crucial. Streams and wells provided fresh water, which was stored in clay jars. Families used water for cooking, drinking, animals, and small gardens. Careful management was especially important during dry periods or times of conflict. These simple practices were essential for the city's survival and resilience. Archaeological evidence shows that Troy's residents were skilled in adapting to change. After fires or partial destruction, homes were rebuilt, streets cleared, and workshops reopened. Families stored grain, repaired tools, and restored walls. Trade continued as much as possible, ensuring access to necessary resources. These practical responses allowed Troy to endure through challenges that might have destroyed a less organized settlement. Troy's location made it both valuable and vulnerable. Its position near the coast allowed control of trade routes, observation of incoming ships, and access to resources. At the same time, it made the city a potential target for groups seeking wealth, influence, or control of trade. This combination of opportunity and risk is reflected in the city's archaeological layers, showing periods of prosperity interrupted by damage and rebuilding. Evidence of social organization appears in the city layout. Larger homes with multiple rooms likely belonged to leaders or families of higher status. Smaller homes housed ordinary families. Streets, workshops, and storage areas were arranged to support the city's daily needs and defense. Coordination among families and leaders allowed Troy to function efficiently, maintain resources, and respond to threats. Even in times of tension, trade and communication continued. Ships brought goods and news from distant regions. Metal, pottery, and textiles moved through the city. Local products were exchanged outward. These connections kept Troy informed and strengthened its ability to adapt to changing conditions. The presence of trade and cultural exchange contributed to the city's long-term survival despite periods of destruction. Daily routines provided stability. Sunrise marked the beginning of work, tending fields, preparing meals, caring for animals, or crafting tools and vessels. Children assisted with chores and learned essential skills. Adults repaired homes, maintained walls, and ensured the community functioned. Elders guided the city, providing experience and knowledge for survival. These routines created continuity, even when conflict disrupted daily life. The city's residents faced challenges, but they adapted through practical measures. They repaired homes and walls after fires, restored workshops, managed water and food, and continued trade. Skills in pottery, weaving, metalworking, and farming allowed Troy to remain self-sufficient. Families taught children these skills, ensuring that knowledge survived across generations. This combination of daily work and strategic planning allowed the city to endure periods of tension. Archaeological layers of Troy preserve both ordinary life and evidence of conflict. Homes, workshops, streets, and walls show repeated cycles of rebuilding. Burned layers indicate attacks, while repaired layers show resilience. Clay vessels, tools, and remnants of textiles reveal practical work and trade. The mound itself is a record of how families lived, worked, and adapted over centuries. These layers provide the foundation for understanding the historical reality behind the legendary Trojan War. The city's endurance was based on ordinary acts as much as defense. Planting crops, tending animals, repairing walls, shaping pottery, and weaving cloth were daily tasks that allowed Troy to survive. Families worked together to manage resources, maintain safety, and prepare for possible threats. These practical acts preserved the city through generations, creating a stable foundation for life, even during periods of conflict. Later storytellers transformed these historical events into the tale of the Trojan War. Heroes, armies, and battles were added, but the foundation came from real events, tensions over trade, strategic location, and periodic conflict. Archaeological evidence shows that Troy experienced destruction, repair, and adaptation, reflecting the practical reality that inspired the later stories. Even as the legend grew, Troy remained a functioning city. Families repaired homes, maintained walls, worked in workshops, and farmed the land. Trade continued when possible, and observation of the surrounding plain and sea was part of daily life. These ordinary measures of survival preserved the city, allowing it to endure through generations and eventually inspire the stories known as the Trojan War. The Mound of Troy is a record of resilience. Each layer reflects rebuilding, adaptation, and care. Families repaired damage, maintained homes and walls, and continued daily routines. Workshops produced necessary items, and trade supported the city's needs. Water and food were managed carefully. The combination of ordinary life and practical defense allowed Troy to persist, providing the foundation for the legendary story that would be told for centuries. Troy's history demonstrates that the Trojan War, while famous as a tale of heroes and battles, is rooted in real events. The city faced conflict, defended itself, and adapted to changing political and economic conditions. Ordinary life, farming, crafting, trading, repairing, and teaching skills ensured that Troy survived. These acts of daily life preserved the city and created the reality behind the later legendary story. The story of the Trojan War, as remembered today, comes from a combination of archaeology, ancient records, and later storytelling. The real history behind it begins with the city of Troy, which was a thriving settlement on a mound near the coast of what is now northwest Turkey. Troy's location gave it access to trade routes, connecting the Aegean Sea to inland regions, making it wealthy and strategically important. These advantages also brought tensions with nearby Greek kingdoms across the sea, who may have sought control or influence over trade and territory. Archaeologists have uncovered multiple layers of settlement at Troy, showing centuries of continuous life. Troy, for example, was a flourishing city with strong stone walls, large houses, workshops, and organized streets. Families lived in homes built from stone, timber, and mud bricks. Courtyards provided space for cooking, storage, and small gardens. Children helped with household chores and learned practical skills from adults. Livestock such as goats, sheep, and cows provided milk, meat, and wool, while dogs helped guard homes and herds. The city's economy relied on both local production and trade. Potters produced vessels for cooking, storing grain, and carrying water. Weavers made cloth from wool and flax for clothing and household use. Metalworkers shaped bronze into tools, knives, and simple ornaments. These goods supported daily life and trade. Troy exported some products like grain, olive oil, and textiles, while importing metals, pottery, and materials not available locally. Trade connected Troy to other Aegean islands, the Greek mainland, and inland Anatolia, allowing the city to flourish economically and culturally. Troy shows evidence of destruction, likely caused by conflict or attack, followed by rebuilding. Burned homes, collapsed walls, and damaged workshops indicate that the city faced serious threats. Archaeologists suggest that these events may correspond to historical conflicts between Troy and Greek kingdoms, or other regional powers, around the Late Bronze Age. While the later story of the Trojan War describes a 10-year siege with famous heroes, the real events were likely shorter attacks, disputes, and periods of tension, rather than one continuous war. Families and leaders responded by repairing homes and walls, storing food, and maintaining workshops, ensuring that the city survived. The walls of Troy were practical tools for protection. Thick stone walls surrounded the city, with gates and observation points. These allowed residents to monitor the plain and the sea, giving them time to prepare for approaching travelers, traders, or potential attackers. Repairs and reinforcements were carried out regularly, showing that defense was a continuous concern. Defense was practical. It protected homes, resources, and families, while also supporting the city's strategic importance. Daily life continued alongside these threats. Families worked the fields, tending wheat, barley, olives, and fruit trees. Animals grazed hills and pastures. Children learned practical skills while helping with chores. Adults balanced household work with responsibilities for defense, workshops, and trade. Elders provided guidance and taught knowledge about farming, crafting, and managing resources. This steady rhythm of life allowed Troy to function even during difficult periods. Water management was essential. Streams and wells provided fresh water, which was stored in clay jars for dry periods. Families divided water for cooking, drinking, animals, and gardens. Proper water use supported survival, especially during times of tension or after attacks. Crops, livestock, and households all depended on careful planning and attention to daily needs. Trade and communication continued even under pressure. Ships brought goods and news from distant regions. Metal, pottery, and textiles moved through the city, while local products were exchanged outward. These connections strengthened Troy and helped it adapt to changing political and economic conditions. Trade also increased the city's strategic value, making it an attractive target for Greek kingdoms and other regional powers, which may have contributed to the conflicts historically linked to the Trojan War. Social organizations supported resilience. Larger homes with multiple rooms belonged to leaders or higher status families, while smaller homes housed ordinary families. Streets, workshops, and storage areas were arranged to support daily life and defense. Coordination among families and leaders allowed Troy to function efficiently, maintain resources, and respond to threats. Cooperation and shared knowledge were essential for survival in a city that faced repeated challenges. Archaeological evidence provides insight into Troy's material culture and daily activities. Pottery fragments, tools, weaving implements, and bronze artifacts show how families produced, worked, and lived. Storage jars and granaries indicate careful preparation for periods of scarcity. Knives, farming tools, and metalworking equipment reflect practical skill. Even small household items reveal the effort needed to maintain city life under both normal and difficult conditions. The mound itself is a record of both ordinary life and periods of conflict. Each layer shows rebuilding after damage, with repaired homes, cleared streets, and reopened workshops. Families maintained daily routines while also preparing for possible threats. These practical responses allowed the city to endure and thrive despite external pressures. The real events that inspired the story of the Trojan War were likely a series of disputes, attacks, and tensions between Troy and the Greek kingdoms across the sea. Historical records, including Hittite correspondence mentioning Wilusa, thought to be Troy, show that the city was involved in regional politics and conflict. Archaeological layers showing destruction and rebuilding confirm that Troy experienced attacks, though not necessarily the continuous decade-long war described in later Greek epics. Despite these challenges, Troy remained a living city. Daily work, farming, crafting, repairing homes, managing water, and tending animals, continued alongside defense and trade. Children learned skills, and elders guided decisions. Families worked together to ensure that homes, workshops, and fields remained functional. This combination of ordinary life and practical defense preserved Troy across generations, creating a foundation for the legendary stories of the Trojan War. The story of the Trojan War grew from this reality. Later storytellers added heroes, armies, and battles. Names of kings and warriors were included, and events were dramatized for narrative purposes. However, the historical foundation was the city's strategic importance, its control of trade, and the repeated conflicts it faced. The war in legend is based on the lived experience of people adapting to threats, protecting their homes, and maintaining daily life over decades. Archaeology helps us separate fact from legend. The mound's layers show strong walls, organized homes, workshops, water storage, and food preparation. They also show destruction, fires, and partial rebuilding. Troy VI and Troy reflect periods of prosperity and conflict. These layers reveal the city's ability to adapt, survive, and continue functioning despite challenges. The evidence confirms that Troy was a real city that faced threats, had wealth, and controlled important trade routes, conditions that could inspire stories of war and siege. Families played a key role in this survival. Each household contributed to the city's defense, maintenance, and economy. Adults farmed, crafted, and repaired structures. Children assisted and learned practical skills. Elders guided families and made decisions for the broader community. This cooperation ensured that Troy could withstand repeated pressures, rebuild after attacks, and maintain its trade and connections with neighboring regions. Even as storytellers created epic tales of the Trojan War, the historical city endured. Daily routines, practical skills, and careful management allowed life to continue. Families repaired damage, produced goods, and maintained food and water supplies. Observation and defense were constant concerns. These ordinary actions were the foundation for the extraordinary stories that would later emerge. In conclusion, the historical Trojan War was rooted in Troy's strategic location, control of trade routes, and repeated encounters with external powers. The city's archaeological layers, including Troy VI and Troy Via, show cycles of growth, destruction, and rebuilding. Daily life, farming, crafting, trading, defending, and maintaining homes, ensured the city's survival. Conflicts and attacks likely occurred, inspiring later Greek storytellers to create the epic narrative known as the Trojan War. The legend is therefore built upon centuries of real, practical life, work, and adaptation in Troy. The Mound of Troy stands today as a record of human resilience. Stone walls, household items, workshops, and fields tell the story of families who lived, worked, and defended their city. The legendary Trojan War emerges from this foundation, a combination of wealth, strategic position, regional tension, and the practical efforts of ordinary people who preserved their homes and community. Through centuries of effort, Troy survived and left a lasting mark on history and imagination. After many generations, Troy remained a city of life, work, and community. Families continued to repair homes, tend animals, work in fields, and produce tools and goods in workshops. Children learned practical skills, while elders guided the households. Water and food were carefully managed. The walls, strong and high, stood as a symbol of the city's care and preparation. Even when attacks occurred or trade was disrupted, people adapted. These repeated cycles of rebuilding and daily work allowed Troy to survive for centuries. The story of the Trojan War, as it appears in later Greek tales, is built on this real-life foundation. The city's strategic location, its control over trade, and the tensions with Greek kingdoms created conditions for conflict. Evidence from archaeology shows destruction, fire, and rebuilding, which may correspond to attacks or disputes in the late Bronze Age. While the epic poems describe heroes, armies, and a long 10-year war, the historical reality was more about periods of tension, defense, and practical survival. Through it all, Troy's residents maintained ordinary life. Families prepared meals from local crops and animals. Children helped with chores and learned skills. Adults repaired homes, maintained workshops, and tended fields. Trade continued when possible. Observation of the sea and the plain allowed the city to respond to visitors or threats. These practical and consistent efforts preserved the city over generations, creating a strong community capable of enduring challenges. The Mound of Troy preserves this history. Each layer shows the work, life, and resilience of its residents. Stone walls, streets, workshops, and household items tell us about both the ordinary daily life and the times of conflict. By studying these layers, archaeologists can see how the city adapted to threats, how families maintained skills and knowledge, and how the community endured long-term changes. In understanding Troy and the Trojan War, we see that history is built from the small, practical actions of ordinary people. Defense, farming, crafting, water management, and teaching skills were all essential to the city's survival. These acts formed the reality behind the legends, and they remind us that even in times of tension, daily life continued, families adapted, and communities persevered. Thank you for listening to this calm history of Troy and the events that inspired the story of the Trojan War. If you enjoyed this bedtime story and want to hear more calm historical storytelling, please consider subscribing and liking the video. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows us to explore more history together in a gentle, relaxing way. Good night, and may the steady lives of the people of Troy bring you peace as you rest.